If you were born between 1945 and 1965, there is a psychological question you may have spent your entire life avoiding. Asterisk. Who were you before the world taught you who to be? Carl Jung believed that every person carries an unseen psychological world beneath the personality they show to others. And as we grow older, that hidden world does something unexpected. It starts speaking, not with a voice, with patterns, with dreams, with strange emotions, with memories that suddenly return after decades, with an unexplained desire to walk away from a life that once seemed perfectly acceptable. And if you were born between 1945 and 1965, there is a reason this may feel especially familiar. You came of age in a world that placed enormous value on responsibility, stability, work, family, reputation, and endurance. You were taught to keep going, to be useful, to be responsible, to handle your problems, to avoid unnecessary emotion, to build something solid and protect it. Those lessons created strength. But Carl Jung would have asked a much more uncomfortable question. What did those lessons force you to hide? Because according to Jungian psychology, what we push away does not simply disappear. It enters the unconscious. And the unconscious has patience. It can wait for decades. You may have spent 40 years becoming the person everyone needed, the dependable husband, the responsible wife, the provider, the professional, the parent who sacrificed, the friend who always listened, the person who never seemed to fall apart. But there is a dangerous psychological mistake hidden inside all of this. You can become so good at playing a role that eventually you mistake the role for yourself. Jung called the social personality the asterisk persona. It is the face we develop to function in the world. Your persona is not necessarily fake. It helped you survive. It helped you belong. It helped you succeed. But it is only one layer of who you are. And sometimes later in life, that layer begins to crack. You may suddenly ask yourself, why doesn't this make me happy anymore? Why do I feel restless when everything looks fine? Why do I want more silence? Why am I no longer interested in impressing people? Why do certain memories keep returning? Why do I feel like there is another life inside me that I never lived? Most people interpret these questions as a problem. Jung might have interpreted them differently. He believed that psychological development does not end when you become successful, raise a family, or reach a certain age. In fact, the later stages of life can bring an entirely different psychological task. The first half of life is often about building an identity. The deeper task is discovering what exists underneath that identity. And this is where something fascinating happens. The unconscious begins sending signals. Perhaps you keep dreaming about an old house, a road you never took, a childhood place you haven't seen in decades. A person from your past suddenly appears in your thoughts. You feel unusually emotional while listening to an old song. You become fascinated by something you ignored your entire life. You start wanting nature, solitude, creativity, spirituality, or simplicity. These experiences can appear random. But Jung believed that dreams and unconscious images often carry psychological meaning. Your conscious mind says, asterisk, everything is fine. Your unconscious may quietly answer, but are you living as yourself? That question can change everything. Because there is a difference between having a successful life And having an authentic life, you can accomplish everything you were supposed to accomplish and still feel that something essential is missing. You can have the house, the career, the savings, the family, the reputation, and still wake up one morning with a strange feeling that you somehow became a stranger to yourself. This is not necessarily failure. It may be the beginning of awareness. Jung's concept of asterisk individuation points toward becoming more psychologically whole, not becoming perfect, but becoming conscious of the different parts of yourself. The strong part, the frightened part, the ambitious part, the wounded part, the playful part, the part that wants approval, and the part that has been quietly waiting for permission to live. But there is one part of Jung's psychology that makes this even more uncomfortable. Your unconscious does not only contain forgotten dreams, it also contains what Jung called the asterisk shadow, the aspects of yourself you have rejected, denied, or refused to acknowledge. And your shadow may be hiding inside the very qualities you are most proud of. The person who is always strong may have a hidden need to be cared for. The person who is always responsible may secretly crave freedom. The person who never gets angry may carry enormous unexpressed resentment. The person who constantly helps everyone may desperately want someone to ask, "What do you need?" Shh. And this is where the story becomes much deeper. Because what if the strange dissatisfaction you feel is not telling you that your life is over? What if it is telling you that asterisk one version of you is over? What if the unconscious is not trying to destroy everything you built? What if it is trying to reveal what you left behind while building it? And there is one particular sign Jungian psychology tells us to pay attention to: the things you cannot explain about yourself. The recurring emotion, the irrational fear, the person you strongly dislike, the dream you cannot forget, the desire that keeps returning, the life you secretly imagine when nobody is watching. Because sometimes the clue to who you really are is hidden inside the very thing you keep telling yourself doesn't matter. And once you understand what your unconscious has been trying to tell you all these years, you may never look at your own life the same way again. The most unsettling thing about the unconscious is that it does not always tell you what you want to hear. It tells you what you have avoided hearing. Carl Jung spent much of his life exploring this hidden territory of the human mind. And one of his most important ideas was that the personality we show the world is only a small part of who we actually are. Beneath it is another world, a world of memories, instincts, desires, fears, dreams, and forgotten parts of ourselves. Jung believed that when something inside us remains unconscious, it can still influence the way we live. You may think you are making a completely rational decision, but underneath that decision could be an old fear, an old wound, or an identity you accepted so long ago that you no longer remember choosing it. And this is where your generation may recognize something uncomfortable. Perhaps you learned very early that being strong was safer than being vulnerable, so you became strong. Perhaps you learned that being useful earned respect, so you became useful. Perhaps you learned that success meant security, so you chased security. Perhaps you learned that your feelings should never become a burden to anyone, so you learned to carry everything alone. There is nothing wrong with these qualities. The problem begins when the adaptation becomes your entire identity. Jung would ask you to look beneath the behavior. Why do you always have to be the strong one? Not whether you are strong. Why do you need to be? That small difference can open an enormous psychological door, because sometimes what looks like confidence is actually fear of needing someone. What looks like independence may be fear of disappointment. What looks like perfectionism may be fear of being judged. And what looks like emotional control may simply be years of emotions waiting for somewhere to go. This is why Jung's concept of the shadow matters. The shadow is not simply the bad side of you, it includes everything your conscious identity does not want to recognize. Maybe you see yourself as endlessly patient, but underneath that patience is anger. Maybe you see yourself as completely selfless, but underneath it is a deep desire to finally be appreciated. Maybe you pride yourself on never needing anyone, but underneath that independence is a longing for connection. The shadow becomes powerful when we refuse to acknowledge it. And sometimes we encounter our shadow through other people. Think about someone who irritates you immediately. You barely know them, yet something about them bothers you. Maybe they speak too confidently. Maybe they demand attention. Maybe they express emotions freely. Maybe they take risks you would never take. Your first reaction might be, I can't stand people like that. But Jungian psychology asks a more interesting question. What exactly about them is disturbing something inside me? Perhaps they possess a quality you have buried. Maybe their freedom reminds you of your own suppressed desire for freedom. Maybe their confidence reminds you of the confidence you never allowed yourself to develop. Maybe their emotional honesty exposes how carefully you have hidden your own emotions. This does not mean every negative reaction is projection, but some are. And learning to recognize the difference is a powerful form of self-awareness. Now, consider another strange phenomenon, regret. Why can one decision from 30 years ago suddenly return to your mind? Why does a forgotten conversation sometimes become vivid again? Why can a song transport you instantly into a completely different period of your life? Because the unconscious does not experience time exactly the way the conscious mind does. Something emotionally unfinished can remain psychologically alive. And perhaps that is why certain memories keep knocking on the door, not necessarily because you need to return to the past, but because you need to understand what the past meant. There is an enormous difference. You don't have to become the person you were at 20. You may simply need to understand what that younger person wanted before life became complicated. What did you stop doing? What did you stop believing? What dream did you abandon because it seemed impractical? What part of yourself did you sacrifice to become acceptable? These questions can be uncomfortable, but discomfort is sometimes evidence that you have reached something important. Jung believed that psychological growth requires us to become conscious of what is unconscious. And that process is not always beautiful. Sometimes it begins with confusion, sometimes loneliness. Sometimes the realization that the life you built was partly built for other people's approval. And sometimes it begins with a very strange feeling. I don't recognize myself anymore. That feeling can frighten you. But perhaps you don't need to recognize the old version of yourself. Perhaps it is disappearing because it has finished its job. Think about a tree. It does not keep every leaf it has ever grown. The leaves fall, the tree remains. And sometimes human development works the same way. An identity falls away, a role falls away, a belief falls away, a relationship with approval falls away. And underneath it, something quieter remains, something more authentic. This is the deeper meaning behind Jung's idea of individuation. It is not about becoming extraordinary. It is about becoming whole, not just the person everyone sees, the complete person, the confident side and the uncertain side, the disciplined side and the playful side, the rational side and the emotional side, the successful side and the wounded side, the person you became and the person you buried along the way. And this is where the unconscious gives you one of its most important clues. Pay attention to what keeps returning. The same dream, the same kind of relationship, the same emotional reaction, the same desire, the same question, the same feeling that something is missing. Partors matter. One strange moment may mean nothing, but when something repeats throughout your life, it deserves attention. Maybe your unconscious has been repeating the message because you were not ready to hear it the first time. And now comes the question that changes the entire journey. What happens when you stop fighting these hidden parts of yourself and finally listen to them? Because Jung's psychology was never simply about discovering your darkness. It was about integrating it. And when that happens, something remarkable begins to change. You stop spending so much energy pretending. You become less interested in proving yourself. You become more comfortable saying no. You stop chasing identities that no longer fit. And slowly, almost without noticing, you begin living from the inside out. But there is one final psychological shift that makes this transformation possible. And it may be the most important lesson Jung left behind. You cannot become your true self by destroying the person you used to be. You become whole by understanding why that person had to exist in the first place. Carl Jung's deepest question was not simply, who are you? It was closer to something more unsettling. How much of your life have you lived consciously? Because you can spend decades making decisions without ever asking where those decisions came from. You can choose the safe career because everyone called it sensible. Choose the respectable life because it earned approval. Stay silent because conflict felt dangerous. Keep working because stopping made you feel worthless. Keep helping everyone because being needed made you feel important. And one day you may realize something, you were making choices. But perhaps you were not always choosing yourself. This is where Jung's idea of individuation becomes more than psychology. It becomes a way of living. Individuation means moving toward psychological wholeness, not perfection, not constant happiness, wholeness. It means recognizing that you contain contradictions. You can be strong and still need help. You can love your family and still need boundaries. You can be grateful for your life and still admit that something needs to change. You can forgive someone and still decide they no longer belong in your inner world. You can be proud of what you achieved and still ask whether it represents who you really are. That last question is especially important because success can become another kind of mask. People see what you accomplished. They don't see what you sacrificed. They see the house, They don't see the exhaustion. They see the confidence. They don't see the years of doubt. They see the person who always had everything under control. They don't see the emotions that were never allowed to speak. Jung's psychology asks you to turn your attention inward, not to escape reality, to understand it. And one of the simplest ways to begin is to observe your reactions. When someone criticizes you, what happens inside?